The man pulled the scope off her rifle in front of 41 people, and he did it slowly, so everyone could watch. He had big hands. That was the first thing you noticed about Gunnery Sergeant Roy Pike. Big hands and a voice that filled a room before he did, and right now both of those things were aimed at a woman lying prone on the concrete of the firing line, a woman who had not said a single word in the 11 minutes since he'd started talking. He worked the 2 ring screws loose with his thumb and forefinger, deliberate, the way a man peels the label off a bottle when he wants you to know he's not in a hurry. The optic came free with a small dry click. He held it up over his head like a fish he caught. The morning was already hot. It was 8:42 in the morning at the range complex outside Quantico, October, and the air over the 1,000-meter lane shimmered the way it does when the ground gives back the heat it stole the night before. Spent brass lay scattered across the firing line from the earlier relays, little brass commas drying in the sun. Somewhere down the lanes a flag hung off a pole, a faded orange thing the color of dried blood, and it was not moving. There was no wind to speak of. That mattered. Remember that the wind was nothing, because in 23 minutes it would be the only thing in the world that mattered to her. Staff Sergeant Dana Khoury lay behind the rifle with her cheek still on the stock, her right eye still where the scope had been, looking at nothing now, at a bare aluminum rail where a $4,000 piece of glass had been bolted 90 seconds ago. She did not look up at Pike. She did not look at the scope in his hand. She breathed out through her teeth, slow, the way you do when you have decided that the thing in front of you is weather, and not an enemy, and you cannot shoot weather, so you wait for it to pass. "Now see, this right here," Pike said, turning with the scope held high so the Marines along the line could all get a good look at it. "This is the problem with the modern Marine Corps." He had an audience, and he knew the size of it. 41 people. A full company minus the ones on the medical chit, and the one kid who'd been left back at the armory to inventory the optics. Boots, most of them, 18 and 19 years old, sunburned necks and fresh haircuts, and they were laughing because a gunny was making a joke, and you laugh when a gunny makes a joke. That's just physics. "The problem," Pike went on, "is we got people in this Corps who think the equipment does the work. We got people who'll tell you they're a shooter, and then you take their little crutch away," he shook the scope, "and there's nothing left. There's just a person lying on the ground holding a stick." A few of them laughed harder at that. One of them, a lance corporal named Tyree, who would tell this story for the rest of his life and get it right every time, did not laugh. He was standing near the ammo table with his arms crossed, and he was looking at the back of Khoury's neck, at the single drop of sweat that had run down from her hairline and was sitting on the collar of her camis, not falling, just sitting there, and he was thinking that he had never in his life seen a person hold that still while being talked to like that. Here is what you need to understand about Dana Khoury, and I'm going to tell you because the file won't. The file never tells you the part that matters. She was 33 years old that morning. She'd grown up in Dearborn, Michigan, the daughter of a man who'd come over from Lebanon in 1979 with a suitcase and a degree in civil engineering that nobody in America would honor. So he fixed transmissions instead, and he raised his daughter to believe 2 things: that the loud man in the room is almost never the dangerous one, and that you do not explain yourself to people who have already decided who you are. She carried a rifle and helmet in 2011 as part of a female engagement team, back when the Corps wasn't sure what to do with women near the front, and put them there anyway because the Afghan women wouldn't talk to men. She'd done 2 more after that. By the time she was lying on that concrete, she had a master's understanding of exterior ballistics, that she'd taught to 400 and some students at the Scout Sniper School, and she had never once raised her voice to do it. She held a coffee cup with two hands, always, a habit she'd picked up in cold places. She checked the exits of a room before she sat down in it, and she would not, ever sit with her back to a door. She was at the range that morning to requalify. That was all. A box on a form. She'd shot the course a dozen times, and she'd shoot it a dozen more, and she had not come to prove anything to anyone, least of all to a gunnery sergeant she'd met 40 minutes ago, whose name she'd already half forgotten. That's the part people miss when they tell the story wrong. She wasn't there to make a point. The point came and found her. "Tell you what," Pike said. He'd stopped pacing. He was standing over her now, 16 feet back and a little to her left, and he tossed the scope, gently, but he tossed it, to the lance corporal at the ammo table, who caught it against his chest with both arms like a man catching a baby. "Staff Sergeant Khoury here is an instructor. Ballistics. She teaches it. So I figure she can teach us all something this morning." He smiled. It was a good smile, white and even, the smile of a man who has gotten by on it. "Let's see her shoot. Iron sights. No glass, no crutch, no kestrel, no dope card. Just her and the rifle and whatever's between her ears. Steel targets already set." He turned and pointed down the lane, way down, past the 400 and the 600 markers, past the heat haze where the world turned to liquid, to a place so far off that the steel plate sitting there was a gray smudge you had to know was there to see it all. "Far one. The 18. The line went a little quieter then. Even the boots, because some of them had been around long enough to know that the 18 meant 1,800 meters, and 1,800 meters is over a mile, and over a mile is not a thing you do with iron sights. It is not a thing anybody does with iron sights. The military maximum effective range tables don't even have a column for it. With a scope, with a spotter, with a good day, and a calm hand, and the kind of rifle that costs more than a car, a mile is a hard shot. Without glass, it's not a hard shot. It's a joke. It was a joke. That was the whole point of it. Pike wasn't asking her to make the shot. He was asking her to miss it, in front of 41 people, so that the lesson, his lesson, the one about crutches and people who think the equipment does the work, would have a body to stand on. The body was supposed to be hers. Dana Khoury heard all of this with her cheek on the stock. She heard the line go quiet. She heard the lance corporal shift his weight at the ammo table. She heard Pike's boots scuff the concrete as he settled back to watch, the way a man settles into a good chair. And somewhere underneath all of that, underneath the words and the laughing and the heat ticking up off the ground, a part of her brain that never really turned off had already started doing arithmetic. She did not know she was going to take the shot yet. That decision was still 20 minutes away, and it would not be made out of pride, which is the thing everybody gets wrong. But the math had started without asking her permission, the way it always did, the way it had started in Helmand on a rooftop in the dark, the way it started every time her eye lined up on something far away. The math was this: no wind, or near enough to none, that orange flag hanging dead. Morning, so the air was still cool and dense, and the bullet would carry true through it before the day's mirage came up and started bending light like a funhouse. The target was steel, which meant she didn't need a hole in paper to confirm. Steel rings, steel talks back, and even a man pretending not to listen would hear it. and the rifle under her hands was a bolt gun she'd shot 10,000 rounds through, an old friend with a worn bolt and grip tape gone smooth at the edges, and she knew exactly where it threw a round when you stripped the glass off it, because, and this is the thing Pike could not have known, the thing nobody on that line knew, she had done it before. Not at 1800. But she'd shot iron at distance, on her own time, on quiet weekends, for years, because her father's other lesson, the one underneath the first two, was that you should be able to do the thing without the tool, in case the day comes when the tool is gone. She had spent a decade getting ready for a tool to be gone. And here was a man who had just taken hers and handed it to a lance corporal, thinking he disarmed her. She closed her eyes for a second. Just one. Behind them, she saw the numbers start to line up like men falling into formation. "Whenever you're ready, Staff Sergeant," Pike said, and a couple of the booths laughed again, lower this time, uncertain, because the quiet woman on the ground hadn't said anything and the not saying was starting to feel like something. Dana opened her eyes. She lifted her head off the stock, the first time she'd moved it in 2 minutes, and she looked, not at Pike, but down the lane at the gray smudge of steel sitting at the far edge of the visible world. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she did a thing that made Lance Corporal Tyree's arms prickle up under his camis, a thing he could never quite explain to anybody afterward but tried to, every time. She smiled. Just a little. Not at Pike. Not at the line. At the target. The way you smile when an old friend walks into a bar you didn't expect to see them in. "Give me a few minutes," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, and it carried farther than Pike's had, somehow, in the new silence. "And somebody mark the time." That was at 8:47 in the morning. "Now." I want to stop the clock right there, with her head up and the smile on her face, and 41 Marines starting to feel the temperature of the morning change, because there's a thing I need you to understand before I tell you what happened next, and it's the most important thing in this whole story. Everybody who tells this one, and people do tell it, in the right rooms, with the door closed, everybody tells it like it's about the shot. Like the point is the mile, the iron sights, the impossible thing made possible. And I understand why. The shot is the part that sounds good out loud. The shot is the part that the Lance Corporal still can't get over 30 years later. But the shot is not the point. The shot was the easy part for her, relatively speaking, and I'll show you the math on that in a minute so you can see what I mean. The point is the 23 minutes. The point is that a man took her tool away to humiliate her, and instead of getting angry, instead of getting loud, instead of doing one single thing he expected, she went quiet, and she went to work, and she turned his humiliation into a problem with a solution, and then she solved it. That's a thing very few people on this earth can do. Most of us, when we get embarrassed in front of a crowd, the embarrassment is the whole event. It fills us up. There's no room left for anything else. We get loud or we get small, and either way the loud man wins, because he made us feel something, and feeling something was the goal. Dana Khoury did not give him the feeling. She took the feeling, and she turned it into wind calls and elevation holds. And that, not the mile, not the steel, not the iron sights, that is the part one wants you to carry out of here tonight. Hold on to it. We'll come back to it. My name's Gunny. I spent 26 years in the Marine Corps, and a good chunk of that around rifles and the people who carry them, and I've got a porch in North Carolina and a Labrador named Bishop who's asleep on it right now. And most mornings I sit out here with a cup of coffee and I tell you all stories about women who served, women whose names mostly didn't make it into any history you'd read in school. I read the files. I talk to the people who were there, when they'll talk, which isn't often, because the good ones never want to. And I found this one in a place I shouldn't have been looking, in a range report from October that has 14 names on it as witnesses, and a blank space where the range master's signature is supposed to be. Just blank. A grown man with 20 years and refused to sign his own paperwork because what he saw didn't fit on the form. The result line reads, and I'm quoting it exact, "Target struck. Single round. Iron sights. Range 1, 800 m. Result, unconfirmed, physically improbable." Physically improbable. A range master wrote that on an official document, and then he wouldn't sign it. I've been chewing on that blank space for a while now, and I think the reason he wouldn't sign isn't that he didn't believe it. He saw it. 14 people saw it. I think he wouldn't sign because signing it would have meant admitting that the thing they all believed about what's possible and about who's allowed to do it was wrong, and some men would rather leave a line blank than write that down. Reminds me of another one, actually. Vasquez, out of Ramadi, few years back. Different weapon, different war, same kind of quiet. I'll tell you about her sometime. The quiet ones are always the ones that stay with me. But tonight we're on a range in October, and a gunnery sergeant named Roy Pike has just handed a $4,000 scope to a lance corporal and told a woman to embarrass herself in front of his whole company. And she's just asked somebody to mark the time. So let me take you back to the firing line, and let me show you what 23 minutes of quiet actually looks like, because it doesn't look like much from the outside, and that's exactly why almost nobody can do it. Do me one small thing first, though. If you've ever had somebody take your tool away, your title, your desk, your rank, your reputation, the thing you used to do your work, and hand it to somebody else with a smile on their face, thinking they'd ended you, let me know you're down there in the comments. Just say, "Marked." That's all. I want to know how many of you are out there tonight, because I've got a feeling it's more of you than the world would ever guess. And the rest of this story is for you in particular. All right, back to the line. She didn't pick the rifle back up right away. That's the first thing the boots didn't understand, and it's the first thing that started turning the laughter into something else. A person who's about to fail, who's been embarrassed, who's scrambling, that person rushes. They want it over. They grab the gun, and they yank around downrange, and they miss, and they get up red-faced, and the loud man wins, and everybody goes back to their day. Dana Khoury did the opposite of all of that. She set the rifle down. She rolled off it, onto her side, and she sat up cross-legged on the concrete, and she pulled a green notebook out of her cargo pocket, a Write in the Rain, the waterproof kind, dog-eared and soft, and she opened it on her knee, and she started to read. "What's she doing?" one of the boots whispered. Nobody answered him, because nobody knew. What she was doing was math, but it was old math. Math she'd written down herself over years of weekends on quiet ranges, and the notebook was full of it. Cold bore data. The way her particular rifle, her old friend with the smooth grip tape, threw the first round of the day before the barrel warmed. The way it threw a round with no scope mass on the rail, because taking 4 ounces of glass off the top of a rifle changes how it whips when it fires, changes the harmonics, moves the point of impact, And most shooters never know that because most shooters never shoot without their glass. She knew it. She'd measured it. It was in the notebook in her own small handwriting, pages of it, and she sat there in the heat, and she read her own past work like a woman checking a recipe she'd written down so she wouldn't have to trust her memory on the day it mattered. 16 feet behind her, Pike's smile was still on his face, but it had started to do a little work to stay there. "You can read all morning, Staff Sergeant," he said. "Doesn't change physics." She didn't look up from the notebook. "No, Gunny," she said. "It doesn't." And the way she said it, agreeing with him, no edge to it at all, just two professionals acknowledging that physics is physics, was somehow worse for him than if she cussed him out, because you can't fight a person who agrees with you. He'd come loaded for an argument, and she wasn't going to give him one. She turned a page. "Here's the math she was doing, and I'm going to give it to you straight because this is the part that separates what she did from a magic trick. And I never want you walking away from one of my stories thinking a woman pulled off something impossible by luck or by movie magic. She didn't. She did it by knowing things, and the things were learnable, and she'd spent 10 years learning them. 1,800 meters. A .300 Win Mag round, which is what that rifle ate, leaves the barrel somewhere around 2,900 feet per second, and by the time it's traveled a mile it's slowed down to below the speed of sound. And when a bullet drops below the speed of sound it gets unstable, it starts to wander. And a lot of shooters won't even try past that line, because past that line the bullet has a mind of its own. She knew exactly where that line was for her load. The 18 was just on the near side of it. Just. Which meant the shot was possible, but only barely, only if everything else was perfect. And the only way to make everything else perfect was to remove every variable she could control, so that the one variable she couldn't, the bullet going transonic at the end of its flight, was the only thing left to chance. So that's what the 23 minutes were. She wasn't hesitating. She wasn't gathering courage. She was removing variables, one at a time, with her hands and her notebook and her eyes, the way you disarm a bomb, except the bomb was a mile away and shaped like everything that could go wrong. She read the Cold War data. Variable removed. She read the no-glass offset she recorded 2 summers ago on a range in Nevada. Variable removed. Then she put the notebook down, and she did something the whole line watched, and almost none of them understood. She took off her wedding ring. Tyree saw it from the ammo table. A plain band, worn thin. She worked it off her finger. It stuck a little at the knuckle, swollen from the heat, and she didn't make a thing of it, didn't look at it, didn't kiss it like in a movie. She just pulled it off and tucked it into the small chest pocket over her heart and buttoned the flap. And Tyree, who was 20 years old and didn't know a single thing about her, understood in that moment that she was clearing herself for work, that the ring came off the way a surgeon scrubs in, and he felt the last of the laughter die in his own chest and turn into something closer to fear. Not fear of her. Fear of being one of the people who'd laughed. She picked the rifle back up. It was 9:04 now. 17 minutes had passed. Pike had stopped talking entirely. 41 Marines were standing on a firing line in the October sun, and not one of them was making a sound, and a faded orange flag hung dead still down the lane, and a woman lay back down on the warm concrete and put her cheek on the stock of a rifle with no scope on it, and lined her eye up through a hole in a piece of steel the size of a grain of rice. at a target a mile away that she could barely see. And then she started to wait. And waiting, it turned out, was the hardest part of all. But I'll tell you about the waiting next. Waiting is a skill. People don't think of it that way. They think shooting is the skill and waiting is just the empty space around it, the dead air before the thing happens. But ask anybody who's done it for real, and they'll tell you the opposite. The shot is a quarter of a second. The waiting is everything else, and the waiting is where most people lose. Here's why. When you lie behind a rifle with your eye on a target and your finger on the trigger, your body starts to betray you almost immediately. Your heart beats, and every beat moves the muzzle a tiny amount. A flutter you can't see, but the target a mile away can, because at a mile the smallest tremor at your end becomes feet of error at the other. Your lungs fill and empty, and the rifle rises and falls with them like a boat on a swell. Your muscles, holding a position, start to fatigue, and fatigue is just shaking you haven't noticed yet. And your mind? Your mind is the worst of all, because your mind wants the thing to be over. It pushes. It says now would be good, take it now, and the now it offers you is almost always a half second too early, when the sight is still drifting, because the mind cannot stand the waiting. So the real skill, the thing it takes 10 years to build, is the skill of doing nothing while everything in you screams to do something. The skill of letting your heart beat and not letting it move you. The skill of breathing the rifle up and down and finding the still point at the bottom of the breath, the natural pause, the half second after you exhale when your body is at rest and the muzzle goes quiet, and learning to release the round into that stillness and not a moment before. That's what Dana Khoury was doing for the next several minutes, while 41 Marines watched and thought, probably, that she was just lying there. She was not just lying there. She was conducting an orchestra of small mutinies in her own body and putting each one down, one at a time, with nothing but attention. She breathed through her teeth. You could hear it, faintly, in the silence, a thin sound, slow, in and out through clenched teeth, which is a thing she did when she concentrated, a thing her students used to imitate behind her back until they figured out it wasn't a quirk, it was the metronome, it was how she kept her body honest. In through the teeth, hold, out through the teeth, and at the bottom of the out, the pause. She'd find the pause, and she'd look at the target, and she'd let the pause go without firing, on purpose, again and again, training her own trigger finger to be patient, teaching it that the pause was not a command to shoot but just a window that would open again and again as many times as she needed it to. The orange flag hung dead, but she didn't trust it. This is something else most people get wrong about wind, and Pike, for all his 20 years, was about to get it wrong out loud. People think wind is one thing, a single arrow pointing one direction, and you read it once, and you hold for it, and you're done. But wind a mile long is not one thing. It's a river with currents in it. The air down by the firing line can be still as a church while the air 400 meters out is sliding left, and the air at the target is doing something else entirely, curling around the berm, eddying off the dirt. A bullet flies through all of it, one slice after another, and it carries the sum of everything it passed through. The flag at her end told her nothing about the river in the middle, so she didn't watch the flag. She watched the mirage. Mirage is the shimmer you see over hot ground, the liquid wobble in the air, and to most people it's just a heat thing, an annoyance, the reason the target looks blurry. To a shooter who knows how to read it, mirage is the wind made visible. The shimmer doesn't just boil straight up. It leans. It drifts. The way it leans tells you which way the air is moving and how fast, all the way down the lane, in layers, if you know how to look. And the morning was just starting to cook, the first real mirage of the day coming up off the 1,000 meters of dirt between her and the steel, and she lay there and read it like text. She read it boiling straight up near the target. Light wind, almost nothing, a half value at most. She read a faint left to right lean about midway down where the lane crossed a low spot. She added it up. Less than 2 miles per hour of crosswind, average, over the whole flight. At 1,800 meters, even 2 miles per hour will push a transonic bullet the better part of 2 feet sideways. She knew exactly how much. She'd done it on paper 100 times. She held for it, not by clicking a scope she didn't have, but by moving her aiming point, by placing the front sight post not on the steel, but on a patch of empty desert to the left of it, a precise distance left, a distance she was holding in her head as a number of target widths, because that's all iron sights let you do. No dials, no glass. Just a post and a hole and a brain that's done the arithmetic and is now translating that arithmetic into a piece of empty air a mile away where the steel is not, trusting that the wind will walk the bullet from the empty air onto the steel during the 4.5 seconds it spends in flight. 4.5 seconds. That's how long the round would be in the air. Long enough to walk to the kitchen. Long enough for the earth itself to turn underneath the bullet, and it does, at that range, the planet rotating beneath the flight path enough that a shooter has to account for it, the Coriolis effect, a thing that sounds like science fiction and is just physics, and she accounted for it, a small hold she'd folded into the rest without even thinking about it, because by now it was reflex. Long enough for everything. Long enough that she would fire, and then she would lie there and wait again, a second waiting nested inside the first. 4.5 seconds of nothing she could do, the round gone and unrecallable, arcing up to the top of its rainbow 40 feet over the desert and starting back down, while the whole company held its breath. But she wasn't there yet. She was still in the first waiting. She was still finding her stillness. I want to show you one piece of the math. The piece, I think, is the most beautiful, because it's the piece that proves she wasn't relying on the impossible. People hear, iron sights at a mile, and they assume she was guessing, that she sent it and prayed. She was not guessing. Here's how she aimed it for elevation, for the drop, with no scope to dial. The rear sight on a service rifle has an aperture you can adjust up and down for range, and clicks, and each click moves the point of impact a known amount. On her rifle, 1/4 minute of angle per click, which at 1,800 meters works out to a hair under 5 inches of vertical movement per click. The bullets drop at that range, from her load, in that cool, dense morning air. She knew to the inch. She'd recorded it. She'd verified it. It was in the green notebook. So the elevation wasn't a guess. It was a count. She'd cranked the rear sight up to the top of its range, and then she knew, from the notebook, that the top of the range still left her a precise amount short, a few feet low, which she would make up by holding the front post high, by placing it not on the center of the steel, but a calculated distance above it, in the empty sky over the target. The same way she was holding left into the empty desert for the wind. So her actual aiming point, the place she was putting that front sight post, was not on the target at all. It was up and to the left, in a piece of empty air where there was nothing but heat and light. A piece of air she'd located by pure arithmetic, and she was betting 4.5 seconds of flight and a mile of distance that gravity would pull the round down, and the wind would push it right, and the two of them together would deliver it onto a gray smudge of steel she could barely see. That's the shot. That's the whole shot. It is not magic. It is a person who knew gravity and wind and her own rifle so completely that she could aim at nothing and hit something. And the reason almost nobody can do it isn't that the math is too hard. The math is the easy part. You can learn the math in a winter. It's that almost nobody can hold still long enough, and quiet enough, and patient enough to let the math work. The math takes a season to learn. The stillness takes 10 years. She had the 10 years. Pike just couldn't see them, because 10 years of stillness doesn't show up on a person standing in line. It only shows up when somebody takes the glass off your rifle and tells you to fail in front of 41 people, and you don't. "Sometime today, Staff Sergeant," Pike said, but it came out thinner than he meant it to. He'd felt the line change behind him. He'd felt his own company stop being his audience and become hers, and he didn't have the words for it, so he reached for the only thing he had, which was the clock and a sneer, and both of them sounded weak in the new quiet, even to him. She didn't answer. She'd stopped being able to hear him a while ago, in the way that matters. He'd become weather again. She was somewhere else down the lane, out at the steel, inside the 4.5 seconds that hadn't happened yet, living them in advance the way she'd lived them 10,000 times on quiet weekends. In through the teeth. Hold. Out through the teeth. The pause. And the pause opened, and this time she didn't let it go. Her body was still, her heart between beats, the mirage leaning just so. The front post sitting in a patch of empty desert sky a precise distance up and left of a target she was no longer even looking at directly, because to shoot iron at distance you don't stare at the target. You can't. The target's too far and too small, and your eye can only focus on one plane at a time. So she'd done what every iron sight shooter learns to do, and put her focus hard on the front sight post, sharp and black and close, and let the target go soft and gray and far, and she trusted the soft gray smudge to be where she'd put it because she'd put it there with arithmetic, and the arithmetic does not blur. She did not jerk the trigger. Nobody who can do this jerks the trigger. She pressed it. She'd taken up the slack minutes ago, found the wall where the slack ends and the real resistance begins, and now she pressed straight back through the wall slower than you'd think a person could press a trigger, so slow that the rifle did not know the shot was coming, and so could not flinch in anticipation. So slow that when the firing pin finally dropped it was almost a surprise to her too, which is the secret, which is the whole secret. The shot you don't see coming is the shot that goes true, because the body can't flinch away from a thing it doesn't expect. The rifle fired. A .300 when mag going off 3 feet from 41 people is a physical event. It is a slap of pressure you feel in your chest, a crack that bounces off the berms and comes back, a gout of muzzle blast that kicked up a little fan of dust and grit off the concrete in front of her. The rifle recoiled hard into her shoulder, the bare rail where the scope had been jumping up, and she rode it, let it come, brought it back down, her eye never leaving the front post, calling her own shot the way a shooter does, reading, in the quarter-second of the break, where the sights were when the round left, and knowing already, before the bullet had gone 100 meters of its mile, that the press had been clean. That is, she was wrong in the math, not in the trigger. The trigger had been perfect. And then there was nothing to do. The round was gone. It was out there now, climbing into the October morning, and there was not a thing on God's earth that she or Pike or anybody could do to change where it came down. 4.5 seconds. That's a long time to lie on warm concrete with your ears ringing and a company holding its breath behind you, and a bullet you can't recall arcing toward a piece of steel a mile away that you aimed a body length to the left of on purpose, trusting a wind you read in the shimmer of the air. 1. The round at the top of its arc, 40 feet up, slowing, starting down. 2. Falling now, the wind beginning to walk it right, off the empty air and toward the steel, exactly as much as she'd asked it to. 3. Tyree, at the ammo table, found he'd stopped breathing and couldn't start again. 4. Pike, 16 feet back, opened his mouth to say something, anything to break the spell, to be loud one more time, and didn't. And in the half-second after the 4, in the silence so total you could hear that orange flag not moving, a sound came back up the lane from a mile away. Faint. Then by distance, and a few seconds late, the way thunder lags the lightning. A high, clear, ringing note. The sound of a bullet hitting steel. The steel talked back. I'm going to leave it there for just a breath, the way it hung there for them on the line, that single ringing note traveling back up a mile of dead still morning air to 41 people who could not believe they'd heard it. Because what happened in the 10 seconds after that note, what Pike did, and what he didn't do, and the one small thing Dana Khoury did with her hands that nobody but Tyree saw, that's the part the range master couldn't sign. That's the blank space on the form. And before I take you there, I want you to do something for me. If you're still with me, if you've been holding your own breath through those 4.5 seconds the way they did, then you already know this story stopped being about a rifle a while ago. So if a woman who refused to get loud, who took the glass off her own rage and aimed it at a problem instead, if she's reached something in you tonight, then go ahead and subscribe and ring the bell, because I tell one of these every few days, and the next one I've got is a woman who had 11 seconds and a colonel coming up the stairs behind her. And you are not going to want to miss what she did with them. Now, the note's still ringing. Let me tell you what the steel started. The note died, and for a second nothing replaced it. That's the thing the boots would all remember, not the sound of the hit, but the silence that came after it, a silence with weight to it, a silence that pressed down on the firing line like a hand. 41 Marines stood in the October sun, and not one of them made a sound, because they had all just watched a thing happen that they'd been told all morning could not happen, that the maximum effective range table said could not happen, that a gunnery sergeant with 20 years had staked his whole performance on not happening. And it had happened anyway. The steel had rung. A mile away, a gray smudge of metal had a fresh silver scar on it where a bullet aimed at empty air had found it. Dana Khoury did not get up. That was the second thing they'd remember. A person who'd just done something impossible, you'd expect them to leap up, to turn around, to find the man who'd doubted them, and let him have it with both eyes at least, if not with the mouth. She didn't. She stayed down behind the rifle for a moment longer, cheek still on the stock, and she ran the bolt, lifted it, drew it back, and the spent brass came spinning out and bounced once on the concrete with a small bright sound and rolled to a stop, and the morning sun caught it, one little brass cylinder lying there steaming faintly on the warm concrete. And it was the only thing moving on the whole firing line. She closed the bolt on an empty chamber. She made the rifle safe. And only then, with the weapon squared away the way she'd squared it away 10,000 times, did she push herself up off the ground and rise to one knee, and then to her feet, unhurried, brushing the grit off the front of her camis with the flat of one hand. She still didn't look at Pike. She reached up to the chest pocket over her heart and unbuttoned the flap and took out the ring and worked it back onto her finger. And it went on easier now. The heat swelling gone down, or maybe just her hands steadier than they'd been 20 minutes ago. And that was the small thing Tyree saw, the thing he'd carry the rest of his life, the ring going back on. Because if you'd watched the whole thing, if you'd seen her take it off before the shot the way a surgeon scrubs in, then you understood what the ring going back on meant. It meant she was off the clock. It meant the work was done, and she was a person again and not an instrument. It meant, and Tyree didn't have these words at 20, but he had them later, that she'd never been trying to prove anything to Pike at all. She'd clocked in to solve a problem, and she'd solved it, and now she was clocking out, and the man who'd taken her scope was so far beneath the level of what had just happened that she didn't owe him so much as a look. Pike found his voice. He had to. A man like that, in front of his own company, with the silence pressing down, he had to put something into the air or be crushed by what was in it. "Lucky," he said. It came out wrong. Too quick, too loud in the quiet, and everybody heard the thing underneath it, which was that he didn't believe it himself. 1 round. 1. No ciders, no walking it in, no second shot to call the first a fluke against. She'd asked for the time to be marked, she'd read her notebook, she'd taken off her ring, she'd waited for the mirage, and she'd set 1 round a mile through dead air with iron sights and rung the steel on the first and only try. There is a word for doing a thing once, and it might be luck. There is no word for the way she'd done it, the deliberateness, the arithmetic, the whole 23-minute architecture of it, that allows for luck. Everybody on that line knew it. Pike knew it most of all, which is exactly why he said the opposite out loud. Dana Khoury heard him. She'd started walking back toward the ammo table to retrieve her gear, and she stopped, and for the first time in 25 minutes, she turned and looked at him. 16 feet. The same 16 feet he'd stood off her shoulder when he'd peeled her scope off to teach her a lesson. She looked at him across it, and Tyree, who was close, said her face had nothing in it. No triumph, no anger, no satisfaction, none of the things you'd put there if you were writing this scene. Just a kind of flat professional assessment, the look you give a piece of equipment you're deciding whether to trust. "Probably," she said. That was all. Probably. She gave him his out. She handed it right back to him, agreed with him the way she'd agreed with him about physics, and it was the cruelest thing she could possibly have done, though there was no cruelty in it, and that was the cruelest part. Because if she'd argued, if she'd said, "No, Gunny, that was skill, that was 10 years of skill, you arrogant son of a bitch," then she'd have been in a fight with him, down on his level, 2 people yelling about his shot, and a fight is something a loud man can win or at least survive. But she didn't fight. She said probably, and she turned back around and walked to the table and started gathering her things, and by agreeing with his lie she made it unbearable to stand inside of, because everyone there could see that she didn't need him to believe it. The truth was a mile downrange with a silver scar on it, and it didn't require his signature. He could call it luck until he died. The steel had still rung. The lance corporal, not Tyree, the other one, the one who'd caught the scope against his chest like a baby, was still holding it. For $1,000 of glass, and he'd forgotten it was in his hands. When Dana reached the table, he held it out to her, both hands, the way you'd return something to its owner, and there was something in his face, something young and stricken, and she took it from him, and their eyes met for a second, and she gave him the smallest nod. "Not a thank you," An absolution, maybe. You were holding it. That's all. You didn't do anything. And the kid's shoulders came down about an inch, and you could see he'd needed that. Needed to be told without words that catching the scope hadn't made him part of it. She seated the optic back on the rail. Snugged the ring screws down with her thumb and forefinger, 2 of them, the same screws Pike had loosened so slowly 25 minutes before, except she did it fast and without ceremony because to her it was just putting a tool back together. And the symmetry of that wasn't lost on Tyree either. The man had taken the rifle apart to humiliate her, slow and theatrical, and she'd put it back together in 9 seconds like it was nothing, like the disassembly had never mattered, because to her it never had. The scope was a tool. She'd just proved she didn't strictly need it. Now she was reattaching it the way you'd pick your good knife back up after you'd been forced to whittle with a rock and proven you could. Now, I told you there was a thing the range master couldn't sign, and I want to be straight with you about what that thing actually was, because it isn't quite what you think. It wasn't that he didn't believe the shot. He'd seen it. 14 of them put their names down as witnesses, and a range master with 20 years doesn't get bullied into writing "target struck" on an official document by a staff sergeant he met that morning. He wrote it because it was true. The range master, his name was Okonkwo, a master sergeant, and he was a serious man. He walked a mile down to the steel himself after, with 2 of the boots, and they found the strike fresh, center mass on the plate, a bright silver crater in the gray, and he stood there and looked at it for a long time, and then he walked the whole mile back, and he filled out the report in his own neat hand. Target struck. Single round. Iron sights. Range 1,800 meters. And then he got to the line that asks for the result classification, the box where you write qualified, or expert, or whatever fits, the box that turns an event into a number the system can file. And there was no box for what he'd seen. There's a category for an expert shot. There's no category for a thing the doctrine says is impossible. So he wrote, in the result line, the only honest words available to him: unconfirmed, physically improbable. He'd confirmed it with his own eyes and his own boots and his own mile of walking, and he still wrote unconfirmed, and I puzzled over that contradiction for a long time before I understood it. He didn't mean unconfirmed as in he doubted it. He meant unconfirmed as in the system has no way to confirm this. There is no instrument in this whole apparatus that can hold what I just saw. It falls through every category we've got. And physically improbable wasn't doubt either. It was awe. It was a serious man's awe, written down in the only register an official form allows, which is the language of the impossible. And then he came to the signature line, and he set down his pen. Because here's the thing about a signature on a military document. It doesn't just say this happened. It says I, the responsible authority, certify this and stand behind it, and will defend it up the chain. And Okonkwo knew, a man with 20 years knows, exactly what would happen if he signed his name to a piece of paper that said a woman made an 1,800-meter iron sight shot, single round, cold. It would not be celebrated. It would be questioned. It would go up the chain and somebody would call it a clerical error, and somebody else would call it impossible because the tables say impossible, and the easiest thing in the world, the thing the system always reaches for, would be to decide that Master Sergeant Okonkwo had made a mistake. That he'd miscounted the range, or miscredited the shooter, or been fooled. His 20 years against a number that wasn't supposed to be possible. And the cleanest way for the system to make the impossible number go away would be to make him go away, just a little, just enough. A note in his file, a quiet question about his judgment, the kind of thing that doesn't end a career but bends it. So he had a choice. He could sign it and stake himself on it and let them come, or he could leave it blank. And he left it blank. Not because he didn't believe her. Because he believed her completely, and he knew the system didn't have room for what he believed, and he wasn't willing to be destroyed for writing down a true thing that the world had decided in advance was false. I don't judge him for it. I want to be clear about that. I sat with this for a while, and I wanted to be angry at the blank space. And then I thought about how many true things get left unsigned every day by people who can see the truth fine, and can also see what it costs to put your name to it. The blank space isn't his cowardice. The blank space is the exact shape of the gap between what Dana Khoury did and what the system was prepared to admit a woman could do. It's a measurement. That empty line measures the distance between the truth and the paperwork, and that distance, it turns out, was bigger than a serious man's courage, which tells you the distance was very big. She didn't ask him to sign it. That's the part that gets me. She finished gathering her gear, and she shouldered her rifle, and on her way off the line she stopped by a conquo, and he started to say something, an apology, maybe, for the blank space, or an explanation, and she just shook her head, once. She'd already understood the whole thing, faster than I understood it, faster than anybody. She knew what signing would cost him, and she knew it wasn't worth his career to certify a thing she didn't need certified. The steel had rung. 14 people had heard it. She didn't require it to become official to know it was true, the same way she hadn't required Pike to believe it. That was the deepest thing about her, the thing under all the arithmetic. She did not outsource her knowledge of what was real to other people's willingness to write it down. She knew what she'd done. The form could say whatever the form needed to say to survive. "Master Sergeant," she said to Okonkwo, "leave it blank. It's fine. Truly." And then, and Tyree swears this is exact, she said, "the ones who need to know already heard it." And she walked off the range, and that was 9:11 in the morning, 24 minutes after she'd asked somebody to mark the time, and she went and requalified on the standard course an hour later with the scope back on her rifle, shot expert, signed her own name in the right box, and drove home. Pike stayed on the line. He had a company to run and a day to finish, and a thing now living inside it that he couldn't put down or talk over. And the boots? Here's what the boots did. Here's the part that mattered more than any of it. The boots didn't laugh again. Not that day, not the next. The morning's whole logic had inverted on them. They'd come out to watch a gunny put a woman in her place, and they'd watched the woman ring steel at a mile with the glass stripped off. And you cannot unsee a thing like that at 19. It rewrites something. Tyree said half his platoon went quiet for a week, and the loud ones, the ones who'd laughed hardest, went quietest of all, because they'd been standing closest to the wrong side of the thing when it happened and they knew it. Some lessons you learn from a manual. Some you learn from a gunnery sergeant. And some you learn from lying in your rack at night, replaying the moment you laughed at someone right before they did the impossible. I'd love to tell you Pike got his. That there was a reckoning, a scene, a comeuppance you could put a bow on. There wasn't, not that day. Loud men mostly don't get reckonings. They get older and quieter, and that's usually the most you can hope for. But there's one more thing, and it happened 4 years later, and it's the reason I'm telling you this story instead of one of the dozen others sitting in my files. So stay with me a little longer, because the end of this one isn't on that range. The end of it is 4 years downrange, in a different building, on a different morning, and it's so quiet you could miss it. For years is long enough for a man to forget almost everything. The smells go first, then the voices, then the faces, and at the very end all that's left is a handful of pictures, faded at the edges like an old Polaroid. But some mornings don't fade. Some mornings stand up in you just as clearly 4 years later as they did the day they happened. And for Tyree, that October morning on the range was exactly that kind. He was a sergeant by then. He'd done a deployment, come home, gotten married, put a meaningless tattoo on his forearm, and regretted it within 6 months. He'd gotten older the way everybody gets older, imperceptibly, and then all at once. But he told the story about the woman and the steel the same way he'd always told it, word for word, and the people who heard it either believed him or they didn't, and he'd long since stopped caring which half they fell into. And Pike retired. 20-some years, the last stripe, the flag folded into a triangle, a ceremony where somebody read his service record out loud, and there was not one word in that record about the range, because there had never been one word about the range written down anywhere. The form stayed blank. Okonkwo never signed it. The event happened and didn't happen at the same time, suspended in that gap between the truth and the paperwork that Okonkwo had measured out with his silence, and the man who tried to humiliate somebody on it walked out of the Corps as if that morning had never occurred. That's how it works. Loud men mostly don't get their reckoning. They just get older and quieter, and that's the most you can hope for. But I promised you an ending that wasn't on the range, and here it is. For years after that morning, in a building in Quantico, a selection board was running. Not a course, a board, the kind that sifts, the kind that decides who even gets near the hardest training, and there was a small panel seated at a long table, and the candidates came in one at a time. Among the people at that table, weighing, sorting, deciding other people's fates with the movement of a pencil, was Staff Sergeant, now Master Sergeant, Dana Khoury. They'd moved her to instruction and evaluation, because the Corps had finally figured out that a person who could explain exterior ballistics to 400 students without raising her voice was worth more on that side of the table than on the firing line. She held her coffee with both hands. She sat where she could see the door. Some things don't change in 4 years. Some things never change. And in through that door, on one of those days, came a young man, not a candidate, a runner, carrying paperwork for the board, and behind him in the hallway, waiting, stood the father of one of the candidates. A civilian now. A polo shirt instead of a uniform. A little thicker through the middle, the way we all get. Gray had worked its way into his temples. But the hands were the same. Big hands. And the voice, when he said something to his son out in the hallway, was the same. It filled the space before the man himself came into it. Pike. He'd brought his son to the board. A proud father, a former gunner, had brought the boy to try out for the thing he himself had once done, and now he stood in the hallway, and he looked through the open door into the room where the panel sat, and his eyes ran along the table, across the faces, across the rank insignia, sizing it up the way men like that size things up, deciding who was in charge here, who was worth that flat, even white smile, and they stopped. On her. Tyree wasn't in that room. I don't know this part from him. I know it from one of the panel members, a man who only agreed to talk to me on the condition that I never use his name, and he told me this quietly, leaning across a table in a coffee shop, like he was still afraid that form was lying blank somewhere and somebody might come asking. He said he'd been watching that face, Pike's face, because he saw it change and didn't understand why, and he wanted to understand. Pike recognized her. Not at first. First the polite recognition of a man who thinks he's seen you somewhere, and then the drop, the collapse, when memory hauls the morning up off the bottom and sets it in front of you, and you understand who this woman is, this woman at the table deciding your son's fate. The panel member said he watched Pike's hand twitch toward his collar, an old gesture, reaching to adjust a stripe that isn't there anymore, an insignia that no longer exists. He said Pike's mouth opened, that he wanted to say something, maybe to say hello, maybe to explain himself, maybe to ask whether she remembered. She remembered. Of course she did. But here's what she did, and this is the last picture I'm going to hand you, and I want you to hold it in your hands the way Tyree held the ring. She raised her eyes from her papers to him, calmly, the same flat professional assessment she'd once given him on the range, sizing up an instrument, deciding whether it could be trusted. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took for him to understand. Yes, she knew who he was. And there was nothing in her face. No triumph. No anger. None of the sweet poison any of us would have poured in there in her place, because God knows she'd earned it, that second, that chance to let him feel from his side of the table what he'd made her feel on the cold concrete 4 years before. She poured none of it in. She just looked at him, the way you look at the weather, like rain out the window that you've noted and moved past. And then she dropped her eyes back to the papers. And that's the whole thing right there. Because the candidate, his son, the boy was good. The panel member told me the boy was genuinely good, the best in his group, and he passed the board honestly, on his own numbers, and Dana Khoury voted for him along with everyone else, evenly and without hesitation, because the boy had earned it, and she was not her father. She didn't punish children for the sins of their fathers. She didn't use the table the way Pike had used the range. She had in her hands the very power he'd held over her that morning, the power to humiliate, the power to take away, the power to make somebody lose in a room full of people, and she just didn't take it. Set it back down on the table untouched, like a ring you slide back on when the work is done. That's what separates people like her from people like him. Not the shot. The shot was just arithmetic and 10 years of holding still. This is 4 years later, at a table, with his son in her hands, not doing to him what he'd done to her, even though she could have, even though no one would have known, even though the form would have stayed blank anyway. A loud man, given power, uses it to make somebody feel small. A quiet person, given the same power, finds that they simply don't need it, and sets it back where it was. And the boy passed the board, and Pike walked him out of that building without saying a word, and I hope, that he understood. That somewhere on the long drive home it landed on him that the woman he tried to break that morning could have broken his son with one stroke of a pencil, and chose not to, and that this was the person he'd spent his whole life pretending to know how to be, standing in front of a formation peeling the scope off another man's rifle. I don't know if he understood. I can't lie to you and say he did. Loud men mostly don't. That's the trouble with loud men. But his son still serves, last I heard, and serves well, and somewhere inside him lives a grade given to him by the woman who remembered his father, and graded the boy fairly anyway, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how it moves forward, one person at a time, the quiet beating the loud not with a shot, but by refusing to become the thing that wounded it. That's why I told you this one, and not one of the dozen others sitting in my files. Not because of the mile. The mile is flashy, the mile makes people gasp, and I gave you all the math so you'd know it was real, that it wasn't magic or a movie, but a woman who knew gravity and wind and her own rifle so completely that she could aim at empty air and hit something. But the mile isn't the point. The point is the 23 minutes of silence, when a man tried to make a lesson out of her humiliation, and she made a wind correction out of his lesson. The point is the blank line on the form, shaped exactly like the distance the world wasn't ready to admit. And the point is the table, for years later, and the power set back down untouched. If you've read this far, then you understood from the start what I was telling you. This stopped being a story about a rifle a long time ago. So if a woman who refused to raise her voice, who stripped the glass off her own rage and aimed it at the problem instead of the man, reached something in you tonight, leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because I tell one of these every few days. And the one I've got teed up next is a woman who had 11 seconds and a curl coming up the stairs behind her, and you will not want to miss what she did with those seconds. And remember, especially you, the one who wrote me, noted, down there in the comments, the one who had the tool taken too, the rank, the table, the reputation, the very thing you did your work with, handed to somebody else with a smile, thinking they were done with you. Listen to me close. They took the glass. They didn't take the 10 years of holding still. They can never take those, because those years are inside you, and they're not on paper, and they don't need anyone's signature to be true. Shoot quiet, and let the steel speak for you.